We're going to look at extension databases and how to use them for outcomes and evaluation tools. So the type of thing we're talking about really is the type of tool that you may use to assess outcomes or evaluate the service that you've offered people. So just a couple of examples. The first of these is the kind of like a questionnaire sort of user survey kind of thing, where one of the questions is how do you feel about the service you've received, and someone ticks boxes to say they're very satisfied, fairly satisfied, not very, so on and so forth. So you ask multiple questions and then the user or the client ticks one of those following responses. The second type is where you may get a score rating at either an initial assessment or the first visit, and you may get a second score at the final assessment. And typically you might rate their ability to do things on a 1 to 10 scale, and then you'd want to see the change between the two scores, so you put the initial and the final. So they're the kind of tools that you generally use for outcomes or evaluations. You generally just have a question or a statement, and then you have a number of responses, and whatever the responses are, it doesn't really matter really. They could be yes, no's, they could be very satisfied, fairly, they could be numeric, it doesn't really matter. You set them up in the same way, but that's the type of thing that we're going to be concentrating on. So if we look at our Charitylog system, what we've got here is we've got some examples, so we can see some like a case study template here which is added as an extension database. We've also got something like the client satisfaction survey where we're going to add that to somebody's record, and we're going to say that they've rated the quality of service, they've said that they get the quality that they need, things like that. That's all added as an extension database. So before you do that, you need to consider where you would like the extension data to be located, because that depends on the reports that you're going to extract. If they're generic and they apply to everybody in the organization, you might consider creating a brand new tab and locating all your outcomes and assessments in the single tab. So then you can have all your outcomes and evaluations all in the same place because everybody uses them, and we can all use the same tool or the same outcome framework. It's a lot easier to locate when we have them on an extra tab than having them on the history page or the contacts page. So maybe consider putting them on a tab, or maybe consider adding them to the actual referral itself. So it depends on whether or not you want to associate the results with the referral record, because then you would have to add the extension database to the referral record. So you could analyze the number of referrals that have outcomes and the number of projects that have certain outcomes attached to them. It's probably easy doing it that way around. So to set that up, you would go into extension database setup, and we would give it a name because everybody's going to be using this, so we'd just click on new extension database setup, and let's just call it the new outcomes tool. Okay, and here we decide whether or not we're going to have multiple results or not. Now most of the time you're going to allow more than one record, but again you need to think about this, because is it a case of one referral equals one result and one outcome? And if you're going to add it to referrals, it may make sense to have one record only, because we do this outcome at the end of the intervention, so therefore we only want one of these to appear, and we're going to switch it on in referrals, and then you decide which project it's going to appear in. If it's the kind of outcomes tool that has the initial stages with the questions and then the final stages and the questions, you're going to need a multiple or one or more records. Again, whether or not that's switched on the referrals, it doesn't really matter, and that allows you to put the initial results on and the end results on. If you want to locate it on a tab, you would obviously create that tab on the Customize Orgs and People selections. You would go to Organizations and People on here, select Client, and the placement here would be on a tab. So either above or below the form, doesn't really matter which way, but if you've got other information on there like the risk form, you may want it below that. So on a tab, and then you just choose which tab you want it to appear. So I've got a tab that I've set up already called Assessments and Outcomes, and I'm going to click it on there. And this means I can add multiple assessments for this outcome, and I can add multiple results onto the same tab. The options are then who would like to see that, and you can decide based on group access who needs to see this tool. Save and edit. And we then usually want the date that this was done, so we'd add a new field, and we'd say date. And the field type for this one would be date, and then we would decide whether or not this is going to be forced, so people have to fill in the date because we really need that. So you might want to consider some of these to be either warnings or forced, and then display order, keep everything as 10, 20, 30, 40, and that display order will be appearing down the right hand side. So if I save that, I'm going to call this one question 1, so I do a new field, call it question 1. This is just the name of the question as it appears to people. The field type on here is going to be usually a drop-down list, which is this option here. and then you're going to take the tick out of the default because you don't want a default answer because it makes it look like somebody's already filled it in, and you can put very satisfied and whatever your responses need to be. Over on the right hand side, click your Swiss flag, and then you could just put your second option in, so satisfied, over to the right, Swiss flag, and then you could just put not very. And you repeat the process for as many question answers as you have in the drop down box. So all you're doing here is you're creating the drop down box for question 1. You'll see there that the display order is 10, 20, 30 because it assumes you want them in that order. If you want to play around with the order, you can just rename these, but generally speaking, as you're adding these, you might want them in a specific order and not appear in an alphabetical order because that wouldn't really make much sense. Then decide whether or not this is going to be a forced question, or whether or not you're going to ask everybody to fill this result in. And display order now would be the second question, so that's going to be display order 20, and save that. So you then get an easy option now. If you're going to repeat question 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and they all have the same answers as question 1, you could use the copy function and call this one question 2. And you can see there it's the same results. It's automatically showing you the display order as 30 and decide whether or not it's going to be forced or left alone, and you can save details. And you repeat the process. So you could just copy all the way down. If you did want a qualitative data, such as a sort of text input, you could have a new field, and you could just put additional comments, because sometimes in outcomes people write additional comments, and we're going to put an additional comments box, churn that into a multi-row text box, which basically is just one of these text boxes, and we want that to be display order 40, like that. Another thing, if you want to add the stages to it, like the initial and the final, we'd add a new field, and we'd call this one maybe the stage. Change that to a drop-down list, and take the tick out of default, and we'll call this one the initial. And click on the little Swiss flag and call this the end. You could have interims as well just by using the Swiss flag options. We'll put this the second in the order, so I'll make this display order 15. And we'll force everybody to fill this in because you're not going to be able to analyze the results whether it's an initial or an end if you don't get that filled in. So we save that. So we just repeat the process depending on whether you want drop-down boxes, multi-row text or number fields, and that's how you would set that up. So when we go back to our client record now, we've set that up on the tab, or it would be located on the referral depending on whichever one you've selected it as, but the principles are still the same. So the layout and the adding of questions and fields is exactly the same whether or not it's placed on a referral or a tab. So if I launch that result now, because I added it to that new tab that I'd created called Assessments and Outcomes, I have this new question that's been added. The new outcomes tool is there to be added. So when I do my first outcome evaluation, I just click on this, I select the date, I select the stage, this is my initial, and I ask the questions, how are you at the moment, and then I ask the responses, they fill it in, and they press save. So that's the first result, and that's my baseline in effect. And when I want to do a final result to compare what they were like at the start, I would go back into it. Because it's on the same tab, I can find it very easily and just add a new outcome to that. And this put my date in there, obviously it would be later, and I would the end, and obviously the client's satisfaction would hopefully change between the initial and the end. And when you compile your reports and your data, you can see the comparison between the initial and the end results. So that's the benefit of adding it into a tab. Everybody can access and see that these have been done. If it was on the history page and attached to the referral, if that's necessary and you need to do that, that's okay, but the consequences are you would be scrolling down on here to find one that has been added in the past that maybe you can add again. So there are consequences to adding them to the referral, but there are sometimes some good reasons why you would need to. So this video, you may also need to watch the other extension database setup video, which explains in more detail how to set it up, but this gives you an overview how they can be used for assessments, outcomes and evaluations. Thank you very much.